Hi, welcome to a new film recap. The film opens with Richard Williams at a nation club attempting to address tennis trainers about turning into a mentor for his girls, Venus and Serena, as he has been setting them up continually for their significance in the game. Each man he addresses turns Richard down, either due to his experience or on the grounds that they are utilized to guardians pushing for their children to be prepared as the following enormous competitors. Venus and Serena pass telephone directories around their area in Compton. They get to the house across the road from theirs, having a place with Mrs. Strickland. She much of the time reprimands Richard's nurturing in light of the fact that she sees him making the young ladies practice out in the downpour. Richard strolls over and tells the young ladies not to converse with Mrs. Strickland as well as the other way around on the grounds that all she does is attempt to bother him up. Richard goes into the house where he resides with his better half Brandy and her girls Tunda, Isha, and Lindria. Richard assembles the young ladies in his transport and takes them to the recreation area where he can rehearse with Venus and Serena. While Tunda is contemplating, she is pestered by a hooligan named Rock, who offers rough remarks to her. Richard gets the young ladies in the transport and defies Rock, letting him know that he has let him know on many times to quit bugging Tunda. However, Rock and his young men simply affront Richard, and Rock punches and kicks him. At the point when they get back, Richard chats with Brandy, who communicates worry with how Richard needs to set up the young ladies for significance, yet he is certain that Venus and Serena will become incredible. He then, at that point, goes to his night work as a safety officer, where he keeps on searching for somebody to mentor the young ladies. Richard meets with Vic Braden subsequent to having watched his educational video, and he presents a video to Vic in person exhibiting Venus and Serena's gifts. However, while Vic thinks they are great, he declines to take them on for training. Subsequent to taking the family out for supper that evening, Richard goes to the recreation area to rehearse alone. Rock and his thugs make an appearance to insult and bug Richard once more. He endeavors to leave them, yet when Rock offers more unrefined remarks about Tunda, Richard whacks him in the face with his tennis racket, and Rock's folks begin beating Richard. Rock gets his firearm out and compromises Richard with it, however at that point chooses to let him be on the grounds that no one will really focus on him. Richard then gets his firearm from his work and cruises all over the local searching for Rock. He tracks down them outside a store, however as he begins strolling toward them with a firearm, another vehicle drives by and shoots Rock dead, provoking Richard to quickly leave. He gets back, where Brandy watches out for his injuries. The following day, Richard takes Venus and Serena to a nation club where he desires to converse with Coach Paul Cohen. They find Paul rehearsing with John McEnroe and Pete Sampras. In spite of the fact that Paul demands that he isn't taking juniors, Richard forces him long enough for Paul to permit the young ladies to show what they have. He hits a couple of balls with Venus, and he is really dazzled with what he sees. Afterward, Richard gets back with the young ladies, who let their sisters know that they got a mentor. In any case, Richard lets Brandy know that Paul is just keen on training Venus free of charge. Richard takes Venus to be trained by Paul, while Brandy stays to assist with instructing Serena. Richard irritates Paul with how he advises Venus to open her position, since Richard accepts he understands what the legitimate position ought to be for her to play. Afterward, Paul shows Richard and Venus a video of Jennifer Capriati to persuade them that Venus ought to begin playing in junior competitions. They are locally available. Venus is placed into the junior competitions, where she goes head-to-head against different young ladies her age, and she hence beats every one of them. After one competition, the young ladies are commending and gloating about Venus's success. Richard has them go into a shop altogether, and he begins driving the transport home since he told them not to boast and is prepared to make them walk 3 miles home until Brandy berates him and makes him pull over so they can get up to speed to the transport. At the point when they return home, Richard makes them watch Cinderella to show them a thing or two about lowliness. Subsequent to rehearsing at the recreation area, Richard returns home to discover a few specialists from social services having been called to the house by Mrs. Strickland under the conviction that the young ladies are being mishandled. Richard demonstrates to the specialists that the young ladies are fine and getting care and schooling. Brandy later goes to defy Mrs. Strickland for settling on the decision to undermine her inconspicuously. The family later goes for one more competition for Venus. However, Serena figures out how to get into a court for herself to play in without Richard knowing. He and Brandy figure out after another parent remarks that Richard has two unbelievably athletic little girls. He strolls with Brandy to find Serena playing and recognizes that she is similarly just about as extraordinary as Venus. The young ladies are accumulated with different players while Nancy Reagan gives a discourse. While this occurs, Paul acquaints Richard with sports specialists George MacArthur and Laird Stabler. The gathering works out positively until Richard feels offended that Laird alludes to Venus's triumphs as incredible, feeling that it is just that way to them since it's an individual of color winning. Despite the fact that Laird and George attempt to account for themselves, Richard simply farts and leaves them. Paul later goes to converse with Richard and Brandy over the episode, and on the grounds that Richard needs to haul Venus out of juniors and have her go facing more expert players. Richard cuts attaches with Paul since he doesn't feel that Paul is attempting to Richard's guidelines and doesn't have their well-being on a fundamental level. Brandy is none excessively satisfied with how Richard took care of everything. Richard later reaches out to Rick Machi to turn into another mentor for both Venus and Serena. He is dazzled with them and offers them an opportunity to prepare out in Florida. Richard persuades Rick to permit the entire family, less Tunda in light of the fact that she is zeroing in on her examinations in school, to move out there together. They all move out there, where Richard rapidly endeavors to offend Rick over how he will mentor the young ladies. Some time elapses, and Rick is demonstrated to be pleased with Venus's work. Richard hauls her out for a meeting and has Serena fill in with Rick. During the meeting, Richard removes the questioner to reprove him for posing Venus certain inquiries, advising him to let her be a youngster. Rick later enlightens Richard regarding a competition in Oakland where they could allow Venus to contend, yet Richard isn't content with Rick conversing with individuals despite his good faith. Rick endeavors to convince Richard, however he decides to consider it. Richard later sees a news report about how Jennifer Capriati was captured for drug use, after Richard had inquired as to whether it was really the case that Jennifer, who was previously trained by Rick, had exited the impending competition since she was worn out. Richard then takes the family to Disney World rather than training. They return home and find Rick hanging tight for them, and he faces Richard for abandoning practice. He lets Rick know that he doesn't believe the young ladies should wind up like Jennifer. Rick hits back that Richard continues thoroughly taking care of himself while imagining it's everything for the young ladies. Venus leaves the house in dissatisfaction, prompting Richard and Brandy contending in the kitchen, where she says she is just remaining with him for her little girls. Richard rehearses with Venus around evening time, where she demands that she needs to contend in the competition, however she feels he doesn't think she is prepared. Richard then enlightens her regarding how when he was a kid in Shreveport, he coincidentally contacted a white man's hand, and he and his companions beat Richard up while he watched his dad take off. He guaranteed himself that he could never take off from his kids. The family goes out to Oakland for the competition. They meet with a specialist who needs to sign Venus in a $3 million arrangement, but since the family isn't prepared to choose, the specialist lets them know that the deal is accessible until the competition starts. Richard communicates his questions over the arrangement to Rick, despite the fact that he thinks Richard is insane to attempt to need to turn this down. Venus lets Rick know that she believes the specialists should perceive how great she truly is. After the discussion is finished, the family is shocked by Tunda appearing for the opposition. Venus initially goes facing Sean Stafford. Albeit the match is serious, Venus comes out successful. Rick later figures out that Venus is set to go facing the top tennis player on the planet, Arantxa Sanchez Vicario. Rick isn't sure about Venus winning, however Richard is. Before the following match, Richard finds Serena gazing at the field. He realizes that she understands left, however he tells her that while Venus will turn into an extraordinary competitor, he accepts Serena will be the best. The evening of the enormous match comes. Venus meshes her hair and emerges onto the court to confront Vicario. She gets areas of strength for going, chafes Vicario. There is a break where Vicario tells others she is going to the restroom, however she takes too lengthy in what is viewed as a deliberate demonstration of disregard against Venus. At the point when she returns, Vicario starts to overwhelm and at last loses Venus. Venus later cries in the storage space, yet Richard and Brandy go to encourage her and guarantee her that this isn't an ideal end for her. At the point when they stroll outside the field, they find other little kids supporting Venus and considering her to be a champion for them. The entire family, in addition to Rick, looks on gladly. The consummation text expresses that 9 months after the fact, Venus marked an agreement with Reebok for $12 million at 15 years old. Serena later joined Venus on Visit 2 years after the fact, despite the fact that Richard actually put their schooling and family above contending. At 41 years old, Venus has won Wimbledon multiple times, turning into the main African-American lady to be positioned number 1. At age 40, Serena turned into a 23-time huge home run champion and is viewed as the best player throughout the entire existence of tennis, very much like Richard anticipated. Thank you for watching.